Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The air was thick with humidity as the sun cast long shadows over the lush green landscape of Boquete, Panama. It was April 1st, 2014, a seemingly normal day in a picturesque town known for its breathtaking mountain views, coffee farms, and adventurous hiking trails. But for two young Dutch women, Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, what started as an exciting journey into the Panamanian wilderness would soon turn into one of the most perplexing disappearance cases in modern history. Kris, 21, and Lisanne, 22, had arrived in Panama just weeks earlier. They had planned to spend 6 weeks volunteering, traveling, and immersing themselves in a new culture before returning to the Netherlands. Both women were intelligent, outgoing, and well prepared for their travels. They had meticulously planned their itinerary, eager to explore the natural beauty of Central America. Their chosen destination on April 1st was the El Pianista Trail, a popular yet challenging hiking route known for its winding paths, dense cloud forests, and panoramic views that stretched for miles. Despite its beauty, the trail was not without risks. Its remoteness meant that hikers had to be well prepared. Kris and Lisanne set off that morning in high spirits. Photographs later recovered from their camera showed them smiling at the entrance of the trail, their backpacks neatly strapped on, dressed in light hiking clothes suitable for the warm afternoon sun. They were last seen by a local guide who waved at them as they started their ascent into the jungle. The hike should have been straightforward, a few hours up to the scenic viewpoint, followed by a return trip before nightfall. But somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. When the women failed to return that evening, no immediate alarm was raised. They had been staying with a local host family, who initially assumed they had extended their hike or decided to camp overnight. But by the following morning, with no word from them and their phones going straight to voicemail, concern began to grow. As the hours stretched into days, their families back in the Netherlands were contacted. Panic set in. Kris and Lisanne were responsible travelers. They would never simply vanish without informing someone. Their parents immediately arranged flights to Panama, desperate to help with the search efforts. The Panamanian authorities quickly launched an operation to locate the missing women. Search teams, helicopters, and local indigenous groups scoured the area. The dense jungle, however, posed immense challenges. The thick canopy made aerial searches nearly impossible, and the rugged terrain meant that ground teams struggled to cover significant distances. Then, after 10 days of relentless searching, hope flickered when a breakthrough came. A local woman in the small village of Alto Romero, far beyond the original search area, reported finding a blue backpack by the edge of a riverbank. It was in pristine condition, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally. Inside the bag were personal belongings, Kris and Lisanne's passports, a water bottle, cash, 2 bras, a camera, and both of their phones. Strangely, there were no signs of struggle, no damage to the items, no blood. It was as if someone had carefully left the bag there to be found. But the most chilling discoveries were on the digital devices. Investigators meticulously examined the phones and camera, hoping for answers. What they found raised more questions than it answered. Call logs revealed that multiple attempts had been made to call emergency services, starting just hours after they began their hike. The first distress call was logged on April 1st at 4:39 p.m., but due to poor reception in the jungle, the calls never went through. For the next 10 days, the women repeatedly tried to call for help. Their battery levels dropped, yet they continued turning their phones on and off, preserving power for as long as possible. The last phone activity was recorded on April 11th, 10 days after they went missing. Then came the most disturbing clue of all, the camera. Over 90 photos had been taken after their disappearance. The last known normal photo showed Kris and Lisanne at the summit of the El Pianista Trail, smiling against the backdrop of misty green mountains. But the photos taken after they vanished were something else entirely. Many were captured in pitch-black darkness, deep in the jungle, in the middle of the night. They depicted unclear images of rocks, twisted branches, and some appeared to be random flashes of light. One showed what looked like a terrified Kris, her face barely visible, her blonde hair tangled and wet. Another showed Lisanne's backpack, resting on a rock. There was no explanation for why these photos had been taken or who had taken them. And then nothing. The discovery of the backpack and digital evidence led to more speculation. Had Kris and Lisanne gotten lost and succumbed to the jungle? Had they been injured? Or worse, had someone been following them, trapping them in the wilderness, playing a sick game of control and terror? The search efforts intensified, but no sign of the women themselves was found. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew colder. Then, 2 months later, the rainforest revealed another grim discovery: a partial human remains. A pelvic bone and a foot, still in a boot, belonging to Lisanne Froon, were found along the same river where the backpack had been recovered. Soon after, a few bone fragments belonging to Kris Kremers were also identified. Tests revealed something chilling. The bones showed no signs of trauma. They had not been cut, broken, or torn apart by animals. Some had even been completely bleached, as if they had been exposed to the elements for far longer than they should have been. Experts were baffled. How could human remains in the middle of a humid jungle end up in such a pristine state? Despite years of investigation, no clear cause of death was ever determined. Theories ranged from a tragic accident to foul play, with some suspecting that the women may have encountered something, or someone, in the jungle that led to their deaths. But the greatest mystery remained. Who had possession of their camera and phones during those 10 days? Who took those eerie photos in the dead of night? And if it was simply an accident, why did it feel like someone had been watching them all along? The case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon remains one of the most chilling unsolved disappearances of the modern era. And to this day, the jungle holds its secrets. The discovery of the backpack and its contents shifted the investigation into high gear. Authorities, search teams, and forensic specialists pored over the evidence, hoping for any clue that might explain what had happened to Kris and Lisanne. The area where the backpack was found became the focal point of the search, but it only deepened the mystery. If the jungle had swallowed the two women whole, why were their belongings, especially delicate items like their phones, passports, and money, left in perfect condition? The indigenous Ngay Bugle people, who lived in remote communities around Boquete, joined the search. Their knowledge of the jungle was unparalleled, and they were the first to warn the authorities of the dangers lurking beneath the lush canopy. The jungle was unforgiving, they said, and anyone lost within it faced nearly insurmountable odds of survival. However, the Ngay Bugle also whispered darker possibilities. The jungle, they warned, was not only a place of natural peril but also of hidden threats, human ones. There were whispers of people who lived in the most isolated parts of the rainforest, avoiding contact with outsiders. Some believed that if Kris and Liz had stumbled into the wrong territory, they may have encountered something far more sinister than a simple case of being lost. Despite the extensive search, the days continued to pass with no new answers. The camera, however, became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators meticulously analyzed the photographs, looking for any clues in the disturbing nighttime images. Each frame was unsettling. The chaotic angles, the overexposed flashes of tree branches, the images of Kris and Lisanne looking distressed. It was clear that these were not casual snapshots. Something had happened that had left them desperate, frightened, and alone in the dark. One of the most debated photographs was one taken on April 8, 7 days after their disappearance. It depicted the back of Kris Kremers' head. Her red hair was illuminated by the camera flash, and her head appeared to be slumped forward. No one could determine if she was unconscious, dead, or simply exhausted beyond comprehension. Adding to the unsettling nature of the photos was their time stamps. Many were taken in the dead of night, 1 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Why would two women lost in the jungle be taking photographs at such an hour? Some experts theorized that they were trying to use the camera flash as a light source, hoping to signal rescuers. Others feared a darker explanation, that someone else had taken the photos. The forensic analysis of the phones was just as puzzling. The call logs showed repeated emergency calls in the first days of their disappearance, but after April 5th, something strange happened. The phone that belonged to Liz was switched on and off multiple times, suggesting someone was trying to preserve battery life. But Kris's phone? It had been switched on again on April 6th, but this time, someone had entered the incorrect PIN multiple times before it permanently locked. Kris had known her phone's PIN, so who was trying to access it? As the evidence piled up, the local authorities found themselves overwhelmed. The case had drawn international media attention, with people across the world speculating about what had happened. Every new discovery only raised more questions. The untouched backpack, the eerie photos, the phone activity, nothing added up. Then came the most harrowing discovery yet. Just weeks after the backpack was found, a new search effort led to the discovery of human remains. A boot containing a partially decomposed foot was found along the same river where the backpack had been left. Nearby, a few bones, confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Kris Kremers, were discovered. The bones were in a strange state. Unlike other bodies recovered in the jungle, Kris's remains showed no evidence of predation. No teeth marks, no signs that scavengers had interfered. Even stranger, the bones were unnaturally clean. Some experts suggested they had been bleached by exposure to the elements, but forensic analysts could not agree on how quickly that could have occurred in the humid rainforest conditions. Lisanne's remains told a similar story. A few scattered bones, her foot still inside her boot. No clear cause of death. No definitive explanation. What had really happened? The police scrambled to come up with answers. Theories ranged from a tragic accident, where the women fell into a river and were washed downstream, to something far more sinister. Had they been followed? Kidnapped? Murdered? To this day, no one knows the full story of what happened to Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. But one thing is certain, the jungle holds secrets, and it has never given them all away. The search for answers intensified as investigators and forensic specialists struggled to piece together the fragmented remains of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon's final days. The discovery of their bones had added more confusion rather than clarity, and the police were under increasing pressure from both the public and the victims' families to provide definitive conclusions. But with each piece of evidence that surfaced, the mystery only deepened. Forensic experts continued to examine the bones, trying to determine how they had been scattered and why some of them appeared to be in such pristine condition. The idea that they had naturally decomposed was heavily debated. Some experts suggested that the bones had been tampered with, perhaps even chemically treated. The clean state of Kris's bones stood in stark contrast to the remains of Lisanne, whose foot was still encased in her boot. If animals had scavenged one set of remains, why had they left the other so intact? In an effort to find more clues, authorities widened their search efforts. More local guides and indigenous trackers were brought in, scouring the jungle for anything that might lead them to the truth. But weeks passed, and nothing conclusive emerged. The jungle seemed to swallow its secrets whole, offering only the occasional unsettling clue before retreating into silence once more. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the case exploded. News outlets across Europe and the Americas followed the story, presenting theories ranging from a tragic hiking accident to something far more sinister. True crime communities and online sleuths dissected every available detail, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps in the official reports. Some speculated that Kris and Lisanne had fallen victim to an unknown predator in the jungle. Others believed they had encountered dangerous individuals who had ensured their silence. Back in the Netherlands, the families of the two women were grappling with their grief while also demanding justice. They worked tirelessly to keep their daughter's case in the spotlight, hoping that someone somewhere might come forward with information. But with every passing day, the likelihood of a definitive answer grew slimmer. Then, another disturbing revelation surfaced. A group of independent investigators who had been studying the case reported anomalies in the call logs retrieved from Lisanne's phone. It appeared that on multiple occasions, the phone had been turned on and used long after Lisanne herself was believed to have perished. The incorrect PIN attempts on Kris's phone had already suggested that someone else had been trying to access the device. But now, it seemed as though Lisanne's phone had been actively used by another party as well. The implications were chilling. If someone had been using the phone, did that mean Kris or Lisanne had survived longer than initially believed? Or had a third party been involved, using their devices for reasons unknown? The Panamanian authorities were hesitant to engage in speculation, But privately, many of the officers working the case had begun to suspect that foul play could not be ruled out. The strange photos on the camera, the odd call activity, and the pristine condition of some of the remains all pointed to a situation that was anything but ordinary. As investigators continued to work through the possibilities, a grim reality settled in. The answers they sought may never come. The jungle had taken Kris and Lisanne, and though it had given back pieces of the story, it refused to reveal the full truth. For the families, the pain of not knowing was unbearable. Their daughters had gone on an adventure full of hope and excitement, only to meet an end shrouded in mystery. And as the case grew colder, the questions remained. What had truly happened in those final days? Had the two women simply lost their way, or had something much darker sealed their fate? In the depths of the Panamanian rainforest, where the canopy stretched high and the rivers ran deep, the answers lay hidden, buried beneath the dense foliage, whispered by the wind and lost to time. As the days turned into weeks, and then months, the case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon continued to baffle investigators. Despite the media frenzy and global attention, the hard facts remained frustratingly elusive. Every new revelation seemed to raise more questions than answers, leading the case further into the realm of speculation and mystery. The forensic reports continued to puzzle experts. The presence of what appeared to be bleached bones sparked intense debate among forensic anthropologists. Natural decomposition in the humid conditions of the Panamanian jungle should have left clear evidence of animal scavenging and environmental exposure. Yet, Kris's bones bore no such marks. While some believed that prolonged exposure to sunlight and river conditions could have caused this effect, others argued that it pointed to human interference. Adding to the eerie nature of the case was the strange call activity. Investigators went over the call logs time and time again, unable to explain why Kris's phone had multiple incorrect PIN attempts after the point when the women were believed to have perished. More unsettling was the fact that Lisanne's phone had been turned on and used intermittently, even when the battery was critically low. Who had been turning it on? Why? And why had no more emergency calls been attempted in the final days? Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, the families of the two women faced a heartbreaking dilemma. Without clear evidence of what had happened, they struggled to find closure. The Dutch authorities had offered support, but with jurisdictional challenges, the Panamanian investigation remained largely independent. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the families hired independent forensic specialists to analyze the case. Their findings only deepened the mystery. One independent analysis suggested that the placement of the backpack seemed too deliberate. Found neatly at the riverbank with all its contents intact, it was as if someone had carefully placed it there to be discovered. The lack of damage or waterlogging indicated that it had not been carried downstream for an extended period. Had someone left it as a clue, or was it a deliberate attempt to mislead the search efforts? In Boquete, the locals had their own theories. Some believed the women had been targeted by opportunistic criminals, perhaps lured away from the trail under the guise of assistance. Others whispered about the isolated communities deeper in the jungle, suggesting that Kris and Liz had stumbled upon something or someone they were never meant to see. But without concrete proof, all that remained were theories. Detective Vasquez, one of the Panamanian officers leading the investigation, was growing increasingly frustrated. He had spent months combing through every piece of evidence, yet the case felt as tangled as the jungle itself. Sitting in his office late one evening, he replayed the images from the recovered camera on his screen. The last known image of Kris, a blurred photo taken in the dead of night, sent a chill through him every time he saw it. "What were you trying to tell us?" he muttered to himself. The weight of the unanswered questions was beginning to take its toll. Every time he thought he was close to understanding, the case slipped through his fingers like sand. Yet, one thing was certain, something had gone terribly wrong in that jungle. Whether it was nature, misfortune, or the hands of another, the truth remained elusive. And so, the search for answers continued. In the dense rainforest, where the wind whispered through the trees and the river carried away all traces of the past, the spirits of Kris and Lisanne lingered, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. As time passed, the case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon began to take on an almost mythic quality. Theories about their fate became the subject of endless debate, with investigators, amateur sleuths, and journalists all attempting to make sense of the few clues that had been left behind. But despite the extensive search efforts and the many experts who had weighed in on the case, the true fate of the two women remained obscured by the jungle's mysteries. One of the most puzzling elements of the case remained the camera photos taken in the days after their disappearance. Investigators continued to study the nighttime images, overexposed flashes of tree branches, dark silhouettes, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be strands of hair close to the lens. While some speculated that the images were attempts to use the camera's flash as a distress signal, others believed they were evidence of something far more sinister. If the women had been lost, why had they not taken more photos of their surroundings in daylight? And if someone else had taken the photos, what was their intent? Another enduring mystery was the discovery of their remains. The inconsistencies in the way their bones had been found, some fragmented and scattered, others unnaturally clean, only deepened the uncertainty. Investigators struggled to reconcile the idea of a natural decomposition process with the stark reality of the evidence before them. If the jungle had taken their lives, why had it left behind such a confusing array of clues? For the families of Kris and Lisanne, the lack of clear answers was agonizing. Their parents had long held out hope that a definitive explanation would emerge, but as the years passed, it became clear that the full story might never be known. In an effort to keep the case alive, they continued to push for more forensic analysis, hoping that advances in technology might one day reveal the truth hidden in the remains and electronic records. Meanwhile, in Bokit, the locals had their own theories. Some spoke of hidden dangers in the jungle, places where few dared to go. There were whispers of criminal activity, of people who operated beyond the reach of the law. Some believed that Kris and Lisanne had been victims of something more organized, an abduction or worse. Others held firm to the belief that the jungle itself was to blame, a vast and unforgiving force that had simply swallowed them whole. Detective Vasquez had spent months on the case, and he still felt haunted by the unanswered questions. Sitting in his office, he flipped through the case files once again. The incomplete emergency calls, the missing evidence, the eerie camera photos. It all suggested something more than a simple hiking accident. But without conclusive proof, the case remained frozen in uncertainty. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Vasquez made one final trip to the place where the backpack had been found. The river flowed as it always had, indifferent to the mystery it had carried. He stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the jungle, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing against him. Perhaps, he thought, the answers had been lost forever. Or perhaps they were still out there, waiting for someone to find them. But for now, the jungle kept its secrets. The months dragged on, and the case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon remained shrouded in unanswered questions. As more time passed, frustration grew, both within the investigation and among the families, who were desperate for any resolution. The discovery of their scattered remains had provided evidence of their deaths, but the mystery of how and why they perished still lingered like a specter over the Panamanian rainforest. Forensic analysts continued their work, scrutinizing every bone fragment, every scrap of evidence, hoping to extract more details. The medical examiners determined that neither set of remains bore obvious signs of trauma, such as fractures or blunt force injuries. The clean nature of Kris's bones, in particular, remained an anomaly. Investigators questioned whether chemical exposure, environmental factors, or even human involvement could have played a role. Some experts argued that tropical conditions could accelerate decomposition, but others dismissed this, pointing out that other bodies found in similar conditions had not shown the same bleaching effect. Despite the lack of definitive forensic conclusions, local authorities attempted to settle on a theory. They leaned toward an accidental death scenario, that the two women had lost their way, fallen into the river, and succumbed to exhaustion, injuries, or drowning. But for many, including their families, this explanation felt incomplete. The forensic anomalies, combined with the chilling evidence found on the women's phones and camera, painted a picture that was far from simple. Investigators returned to the phone data repeatedly, tracing the desperate attempts made to reach emergency services. The fact that Kris's phone had multiple incorrect PIN attempts after she was believed to have died remained deeply unsettling. If Lisanne had been alive at that point, why wouldn't she have known the correct pin? And if someone else had been using the phone, who was it? Detective Vasquez had long struggled with these questions. He had spoken with dozens of locals, retraced the women's steps, and pored over every shred of evidence, yet nothing fully explained what had happened in those lost days. There were too many inconsistencies, too many gaps. Something was missing, something critical. A new search effort was organized, this time focusing on the more remote sections of the jungle, deeper than previous expeditions had gone. Indigenous trackers were once again brought in to assist, relying on their extensive knowledge of the terrain. The hope was that perhaps there were still items undiscovered, hidden away beneath the thick canopy or buried by time. As the search teams moved through the rainforest, they found themselves navigating treacherous terrain, mudslides, unstable ground, and winding river paths that could easily disorient even experienced hikers. The extreme isolation of the area emphasized just how dangerous the environment had been for Kris and Lisanne. If they had been lost, surviving for more than a few days would have been a nearly impossible feat. Then another chilling discovery was made. A small piece of fabric, tangled in the roots of a tree near a ravine, was found several kilometers away from where the other remains had been located. It matched the clothing Kris had been wearing in the recovered photographs. But how had it ended up so far from the other remains? Had it been moved by water, by animals, or by someone else? The discovery reignited discussions about possible foul play. Could someone have been involved in their deaths after all? The positioning of the remains, the scattered nature of their belongings, and the peculiar evidence left behind all seemed to suggest something beyond a simple hiking accident. Back in the Netherlands, the women's families followed every development closely. The pain of not knowing had become a permanent ache. The Dutch authorities had continued their cooperation with Panama, but without new leads, they were as helpless as anyone else. At night, in the quiet of her room, Kris's mother often stared at the last known photographs of her daughter, searching for answers in those blurred, haunting images. What had Kris and Lisanne seen in those final moments? Why had they taken those photos? The fear in their expressions was evident. But fear of what? Detective Vasquez, despite his frustration, refused to give up. He spent nights replaying interviews, going over statements, trying to find a detail, any detail, that might have been overlooked. He had dealt with missing persons cases before, but none had ever unsettled him quite like this one. As the case dragged on, whispers of conspiracy theories grew louder. Some suggested that the women had stumbled upon illegal activity deep in the jungle, perhaps a hidden operation, a cartel presence, or something equally dangerous. Others insisted that there was an unknown third party involved, someone who had been monitoring them, moving their belongings, and toying with the investigation. No hard evidence existed to prove these theories, but the strangeness of the case kept them alive. Even seasoned investigators found themselves unable to dismiss the possibility that Kris and Lisanne had not been alone in their final moments. Despite all the speculation, the truth remained as elusive as ever. The jungle, with its endless depths and hidden dangers, kept its secrets well. And though the world had not forgotten Kris and Lisanne, the one thing that everyone desperately wanted, the full truth, remained just out of reach, hidden beneath the canopy, waiting to be uncovered. The more investigators searched for answers, the deeper the mystery of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon became. Every discovery raised more questions, and the passage of time only solidified the unsettling fact that they might never know exactly what had happened in the dense Panamanian jungle. But as the months turned into years, the case refused to fade away. The strange circumstances of their disappearance and the chilling evidence left behind continued to haunt those who had tried to uncover the truth. Detective Vasquez found himself revisiting the case more often than he liked to admit. Though the official investigation had grown cold, something about it nagged at him, an unshakable feeling that there was something they had missed. He kept the case files in his desk, poring over the details at odd hours, unable to shake the sense that the key to the mystery was hidden in plain sight. Among the most baffling pieces of evidence remained the camera photos taken at night. Investigators had exhausted every theory, from attempts to signal for help to evidence of an unknown threat lurking in the darkness. Some images appeared to be taken at random, almost as if someone had been testing the flash. Others, however, showed signs of calculated intent. like the haunting image of Kris's hair caught in the frame, the disorienting close-ups of tree branches, and the eerie angles that seemed almost staged. Who had taken those pictures? Had it been Kris and Lisanne themselves? Or had someone else been behind the lens, documenting their suffering in some twisted way? Meanwhile, forensic experts continued their analysis of the bone fragments found scattered along the riverbanks. What stood out the most was the apparent difference in the condition of the remains. Kris's bones were unusually clean and lacked signs of scavenger activity, while Lisanne's foot was still partially intact inside her boot. This inconsistency only fueled theories that their bodies had not decomposed naturally and that some kind of outside force had interfered. Adding to the confusion, additional small bone fragments were found in different locations, some miles apart from the initial discovery site. This raised another disturbing question. Had their remains been moved? And if so, by whom? As the Dutch and Panamanian authorities continued their exchange of information, the families of Kris and Lisanne grew increasingly frustrated. They had hoped for definitive answers, but none came. The official reports favored an accidental death scenario, but neither family was fully convinced. Kris's father, Kris Kremers, pushed for more independent forensic analysis. He questioned the way the bones had been discovered, the lack of conclusive DNA testing on certain fragments, and the discrepancies in the condition of the remains. If his daughter had truly died of natural causes, why did so many details not add up? Lisanne's parents, too, struggled with the uncertainty. They could not fathom how two young women, well-prepared and experienced in travel, had simply vanished without leaving behind a clearer trail. And if they had died due to natural causes, why had their belongings and remains been discovered in such odd and scattered patterns? Online forums and independent investigators refused to let the case rest. Theories ranging from criminal involvement to cult activity to drug trafficking swirled in the background, and while none could be proven, none could be entirely dismissed either. Then another possible breakthrough came. A former guide who had led expeditions in the jungle contacted an independent journalist. He claimed to have found something disturbing in one of the remote areas near the original disappearance site. Though he was hesitant to go into detail over the phone, he hinted at evidence that suggested human interference, a discovery that could shift the entire case. Detective Vasquez, hearing of this development, couldn't ignore the possibility that there was still something out there, something that could rewrite the story that had been told for years. Was there truly more to uncover? Had Kris and Lisanne been victims of more than just an unfortunate accident? Or was the jungle simply hiding its secrets in the way only nature could, swallowing them whole, never to be revealed? Detective Vasquez couldn't shake the feeling that they had been missing something crucial all along. The discovery of Kris and Lisanne's remains had provided only fragments of the truth, and even those seemed inconsistent. When he received word of the former guide's claim about potential new evidence, his instincts told him to follow up, even though the official case had long since gone cold. The guide, Miguel Ortega, had been working in the jungle for over 2 decades. He was not the type to fabricate stories. When he finally met with Vasquez, his demeanor was solemn. "I never wanted to get involved," Ortega admitted, his voice low. "I saw what happened to others who spoke too much." Vasquez studied him carefully. "What did you find?" Ortega hesitated before pulling out a small bag. He placed it on the table between them and slowly unzipped it. Inside was a piece of fabric, weathered but unmistakably a part of a backpack strap. "This was not here before," Ortega said. "I pass through this area often. Someone placed it there recently." The location where the fabric had been found was even more puzzling. It was deep in the jungle, miles away from where Kris and Lisanne's bones had been discovered. There was no logical explanation for why a fresh piece of evidence would suddenly appear, years after their disappearance. Vasquez's mind raced. Was someone trying to send a message? Or had they simply grown careless? Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, the families of Kris and Liz were growing increasingly desperate for closure. The Dutch authorities had long since classified the case as unresolved, but not actively being investigated. Yet small discoveries like the one Ortega had made kept hope alive, even as it tormented them with the possibility that their daughters had met a far worse fate than initially believed. In an effort to push for further action, the Kremers and Froon families reached out to private investigators who specialized in international cold cases. One of them, a former law enforcement official named David Lammers, had spent years working in Latin America and was familiar with cases involving missing foreigners. After reviewing the details, Lammers was struck by the pattern of anomalies in the evidence. The positioning of the remains, the strange call activity, and now the emergence of new physical evidence. It all pointed to something beyond an accidental death. This wasn't nature, Lammers stated flatly. This was human involvement. Back in Panama, Vasquez struggled with what to do next. The official stance was that Kris and Lisanne had been victims of a tragic accident, but everything within him resisted that conclusion. If someone had moved their remains, tampered with their belongings, or had even been in possession of their phones after their disappearance, then that meant one thing. Someone else knew the truth. Determined, Vasquez decided to take a risk. He contacted Ortega again and asked him to guide him back into the jungle, to the exact spot where the backpack strap had been found. They prepared for the trek carefully, knowing that whoever had left the evidence behind may still be watching. As they moved deeper into the dense rainforest, the oppressive heat and thick foliage made the journey slow and exhausting. But when they reached the area Ortega had marked, something else caught their eye, a disturbed patch of earth, as though something had recently been dug up or buried. Ortega and Vasquez exchanged a look. Carefully, they began to dig. What they unearthed would change the course of the investigation forever. The moment the first scoop of earth was removed, Detective Vasquez and Miguel Ortega knew they had stumbled upon something significant. The soil had been disturbed recently, a sharp contrast to the otherwise untouched jungle floor. As they dug deeper, their breaths grew shallow, anticipation building like an electric charge in the thick, humid air. Then they saw it, a bundle of cloth partially buried, its edges stained with dirt and moisture. Ortega hesitated, exchanging a wary glance with Vasquez before carefully pulling it free. The fabric was old but intact, its colors faded from exposure to the elements. As they unfolded it, their worst fears were confirmed. Inside the bundle were personal belongings, small, unassuming objects that had once belonged to Kris and Lisanne. A water bottle, a small notebook, a hair tie, and most chillingly, a phone case without a phone inside. The placement of these items raised more questions than it answered. Why had they been buried separately from the rest of the evidence? And more importantly, who had put them there? Vasquez wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to steady his thoughts. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This means someone had their belongings long after they disappeared." Ortega nodded, his jaw tightening. "This wasn't washed down by the river. Someone put it here. Recently." The discovery reignited suspicions that the women had not simply gotten lost. The forensic inconsistencies, the scattered remains, the manipulated phone activity, all of it pointed to human involvement. Yet there was still no definitive proof of foul play, only a series of eerie coincidences that refused to add up. Determined to make sense of the discovery, Vasquez arranged for forensic experts to analyze the newly recovered items. If fingerprints or DNA traces remained, it could be the break they needed to push the case forward. But deep down, he feared that whoever had placed the items there had done so carefully, ensuring that no traces would be left behind. Meanwhile, news of the discovery reached the Netherlands, where the families of Kris and Lisanne had long resigned themselves to the painful ambiguity of their daughter's fate. For Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, the emergence of new evidence was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it reignited hope that the truth might finally be uncovered. On the other, it confirmed their worst fear, that someone had known more all along and had kept it hidden. A press conference was held in Boquete, where Panamanian officials addressed the media. The spokesperson was careful with his words, stating that while the discovery was significant, there was still no evidence of a crime. "We continue to follow all leads," he assured reporters. But for those closely following the case, the vagueness of his response only fueled suspicion that the full truth was being carefully controlled. As Vasquez awaited the forensic results, he revisited every detail of the case. The call logs, the eerie nighttime photos, the incorrect pin attempts on Kris's phone. He pieced together a timeline in his mind, trying to find the moment when things had gone wrong. One thing was certain: if someone had buried these belongings, they had done so with purpose. Then late one evening, his phone rang. It was a forensic analyst from the lab. The voice on the other end was tense. "Detective, we found something." Vasquez gripped his phone tighter. "What is it?" There was a pause before the analyst spoke again. "There were fingerprints. And they don't belong to Kris or Lisanne." Detective Vasquez sat frozen, gripping his phone as the forensic analyst's words sank in. "There were fingerprints. And they don't belong to Kris or Lisanne." His mind raced. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, concrete evidence that someone else had been involved in the case. Someone who had handled the belongings, who had touched their things long after their disappearance. "Who do they belong to?" Vasquez asked, his voice tight. "We're still running the prints through the database," the analyst replied. "But there's more. The pattern of degradation on the objects suggests they weren't exposed to the elements for years. These items were buried much more recently than when the women disappeared." A cold shiver ran down Vasquez's spine. The implication was chilling. Someone had been holding on to Kris and Lisanne's belongings for years before burying them. But why? As soon as he hung up, Vasquez mobilized his team. This new revelation meant that the case had to be reopened in full force. It was no longer just about a disappearance. It was now about tracking down an individual who had potentially been hiding the truth all along. Meanwhile, the news of the fingerprint discovery reached the families in the Netherlands. Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were both called personally by the investigators, and though they had fought for answers for years, this particular development filled them with unease. Who had been keeping their daughter's belongings? And why reveal them now? The press quickly picked up on the news, and speculation exploded across social media. True crime communities, armchair detectives, and journalists debated the significance of the findings. Theories ranged from an undiscovered local witness who had been afraid to speak out, to a more sinister scenario. Someone who had been watching the investigation unfold and strategically revealing evidence only when necessary. Back in Panama, Vasquez received an update from the forensic lab. They had a match. The fingerprints belonged to a local man, Marco Villarreal. He was a former tour guide who had worked along the trails surrounding Boquete for years. His name had never appeared in the investigation before, but now he was at the center of it all. With this new lead, Vasquez and his team quickly obtained a warrant to bring Villarreal in for questioning. They tracked him to a small home on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, Villarreal didn't seem surprised to see them. "I knew this day would come," he said as they escorted him to the police station. As the interrogation began, Villarreal sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't denying involvement, but he also wasn't offering any explanations. "Why were your fingerprints found on Kris and Lisanne's belongings?" Vasquez asked, keeping his voice steady. Villarreal exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. "Because I found them," he said finally. "Found them where?" Villarreal hesitated. "Deep in the jungle, near a place tourists don't go." The room went silent. Vasquez leaned forward. "Why didn't you turn them in?" Another pause. Then Villarreal looked up, and for the first time, there was something resembling fear in his eyes. "Because I wasn't the only one who knew they were there." Vasquez's pulse quickened. "Who else knew?" Villarreal shook his head. "You don't understand. I was told not to say anything. It was safer that way." Vasquez stared at him, his gut telling him they had only scratched the surface. Who was Villarreal afraid of? And what else was he hiding? One thing was certain, this case was far from over. Detective Vasquez sat frozen, gripping his phone as the forensic analyst's words sank in. "There were fingerprints, and they don't belong to Kris or Lisanne." His mind raced. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, concrete evidence that someone else had been involved in the case. Someone who had handled the belongings, who had touched their things long after their disappearance. "Who do they belong to?" Vasquez asked, his voice tight. "We're still running the prints through the database," the analyst replied. "But there's more. The pattern of degradation on the objects suggests they weren't exposed to the elements for years. These items were buried much more recently than when the women disappeared." A cold shiver ran down Vasquez's spine. The implication was chilling. Someone had been holding on to Kris and Lisanne's belongings for years before burying them. But why? As soon as he hung up, Vasquez mobilized his team. This new revelation meant that the case had to be reopened in full force. It was no longer just about a disappearance. It was now about tracking down an individual who had potentially been hiding the truth all along. Meanwhile, the news of the fingerprint discovery reached the families in the Netherlands. Hans Kremers and Lisanne Froon were both called personally by the investigators, and though they had fought for answers for years, this particular development filled them with unease. Who had been keeping their daughter's belongings? And why reveal them now? The press quickly picked up on the news, and speculation exploded across social media. True crime communities, armchair detectives, and journalists debated the significance of the findings. Theories ranged from an undiscovered local witness who had been afraid to speak out, to a more sinister scenario. Someone who had been watching the investigation unfold and strategically revealing evidence only when necessary. Back in Panama, Vasquez received an update from the forensic lab. They had a match. The fingerprints belonged to a local man, Marco Villarreal. He was a former tour guide who had worked along the trails surrounding Boquete for years. His name had never appeared in the investigation before, but now he was at the center of it all. With this new lead, Vasquez and his team quickly obtained a warrant to bring Villarreal in for questioning. They tracked him to a small home on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, Villarreal didn't seem surprised to see them. "I knew this day would come," he said as they escorted him to the police station. As the interrogation began, Villarreal sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't denying involvement, but he also wasn't offering any explanations. "Why were your fingerprints found on Kris and Lisanne's belongings?" Vasquez asked, keeping his voice steady. Villarreal exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. "Because I found them," he said finally. "Found them where?" Villarreal hesitated. "Deep in the jungle, near a place tourists don't go." The room went silent. Vasquez leaned forward. "Why didn't you turn them in?" Another pause. Then Villarreal looked up, and for the first time, there was something resembling fear in his eyes. "Because I wasn't the only one who knew they were there." Vasquez's pulse quickened. "Who else knew?" Villarreal shook his head. "You don't understand. I was told not to say anything. It was safer that way." Vasquez stared at him, his gut telling him they had only scratched the surface. Who was Villarreal afraid of? And what else was he hiding? One thing was certain, this case was far from over. Detective Vasquez wasted no time after his conversation with Marco Villarreal. He assembled a small team and planned to search for El Sombrero, the mysterious figure who had seemingly known more about Kris and Lisanne's disappearance than he should have. But finding him wouldn't be easy. The jungle was vast, and those who knew its depths had long mastered the art of disappearing within it. Villarreal, still visibly anxious, hesitated as he prepared to guide them into the dense rainforest. "I don't know if this is a good idea," he muttered under his breath. "Some people don't want this case solved." Vasquez shot him a sharp look. "And what about the families? What about justice?" Villarreal sighed, gripping the straps of his backpack. "I just hope we don't find more than we're looking for." They set out at dawn, the jungle damp with the lingering mist of the night. Every step deeper into the wilderness carried an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustling of unseen creatures. Villarreal led them through winding paths that had long been swallowed by the undergrowth. Hours passed before they reached a small clearing where an old wooden shack stood, half covered by vines. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney, a sign that someone was inside. Vasquez signaled for his men to spread out, encircling the structure. Villarreal swallowed hard. "This is it." Vasquez approached the door, knocking firmly. "Policia, open up." Silence. Then the sound of movement inside. Footsteps shifting. The tension thickened. Vasquez motioned for his men to stay ready. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a wiry old man with deep-set eyes and weathered skin. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the knowing look in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Vasquez held up his badge. "We have questions about Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon." El Sombrero exhaled slowly, stepping back to let them in. The inside of the shack was dimly lit, cluttered with old maps, a rusted machete hanging on the wall, and a table covered in yellowed papers. "You want answers?" he said, sitting down. "Then you'd better be ready for them." Vasquez took a seat across from him. "What do you know?" El Sombrero studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. They were not alone in that jungle. A chill ran through the room. Vasquez's grip tightened on his notepad. Who else was there? El Sombrero's gaze flickered to Villarreal before returning to Vasquez. People who don't want to be found. People who have lived in those trees longer than any of you have been alive. They saw those girls. They watched them. A heavy silence fell over the room. Did they take them? Vasquez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. El Sombrero didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a battered wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside were trinkets, old coins, and a silver necklace with a small pendant. Vasquez's breath caught. The families had described Kris wearing a necklace just like this one. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. El Sombrero's eyes darkened. "I didn't find it. It was left for me." A shiver crawled up Vasquez's spine. Someone had wanted him to see this. Someone had wanted the truth to remain buried, but at the same time, they had left behind just enough to haunt those who searched. And that meant even after all these years, the real story was still out there, hidden in the shadows of the jungle. Detective Vasquez felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck as he stared at the silver necklace lying in El Sombrero's weathered hand. The small pendant caught the dim light filtering through the shack's cracks, casting eerie reflections across the wooden table. "This belonged to Kris Kremers," Vasquez murmured, though he already knew the answer. El Sombrero nodded, his dark eyes unreadable. "It was left near my door weeks after the search had died down." "No note. No explanation." Vasquez clenched his fists. "And you didn't think to bring this to the authorities?" The old man exhaled sharply. "Do you know how many people disappear in those trees?" he asked. "Some are found. Most are never spoken of again." Villarreal shifted uncomfortably beside Vasquez. "So what are you saying? That someone out there wanted you to have this?" El Sombrero leaned forward. "I'm saying someone wanted me to see this. To know that it was left behind deliberately." The weight of his words hung in the air. Vasquez's mind raced. If someone had placed the necklace there after the official search was called off, it meant that either Kris had survived longer than initially thought, or someone had been holding on to her belongings for a reason. And that reason, whatever it was dark enough to keep buried for years. He took a deep breath. "Do you have any idea who could have left it?" El Sombrero didn't respond immediately. He reached for a metal tin on the table, popping it open with a soft clink. Inside were hand-rolled cigarettes, dried leaves, and something Vasquez hadn't expected, a map. It was old, edges worn, but as El Sombrero unfolded it, Vasquez saw that it was marked with a series of small red X's. "What is this?" Vasquez asked. El Sombrero tapped a bony finger against one of the marks. "Places where things have been found," he muttered. "Not just their belongings. Other things." Vasquez exchanged a glance with Villarreal. "Other things." El Sombrero nodded. "Clothing, jewelry, remnants. People don't want to talk about it, but the jungle doesn't just swallow things whole. Sometimes it spits them back out." A chill crawled up Vasquez's spine. If the necklace had been deliberately placed, it meant that someone, maybe even multiple people, knew the truth but were choosing to reveal it in fragments. But why? Why not come forward completely? "Whoever left this," Vasquez said slowly, "wanted you to see it. That means they're watching." El Sombrero's lips pressed into a thin line. "They always are." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vasquez had worked dozens of missing persons cases, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. There was something more at play, something that had remained hidden in the jungle's depths for far too long. Villarreal finally broke the silence. "So what do we do now?" Vasquez folded the map carefully, tucking it into his bag. "We follow the trail," he said, "and we find out just how much this jungle has been hiding." The jungle felt different now. As Detective Vasquez and his team ventured deeper along the trails marked on El Sombrero's map, a heavy silence settled over them. Even the ever-present hum of insects seemed to fade into the background. The weight of unseen eyes followed them, an unshakable presence lingering just beyond their reach. Villarreal, who had been reluctant from the start, trudged alongside Vasquez with unease. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "We're looking for ghosts in a place that doesn't want to give them up." Vasquez ignored him, his focus locked on the map. The red X's marked locations that had never been searched by authorities, deep within the jungle, beyond the beaten paths where tourists dared to go. If El Sombrero was right, these were places where remnants of the missing had surfaced over the years. Hours passed as they hacked their way through dense foliage, the heat oppressive, sweat soaking through their clothes. Then, at the edge of a ravine, they found something. A shoe, partially buried beneath a tangle of roots. Vasquez knelt, brushing away the dirt carefully. The shoe was faded blue, its sole nearly detached from the upper fabric. The team stood in eerie silence as the reality of the find sank in. It was eerily similar to what had been described in reports about Kris Kremers' last known possessions. "Bag it," Vasquez ordered. "We'll get forensics to analyze it." Villarreal exhaled sharply, his nerves wearing thin. "This doesn't mean anything. Could belong to anyone." Vasquez shot him a look. "Then why was it left here in one of the marked spots?" No answer. They continued further into the marked area, their senses heightened. Every rustling leaf, every distant movement set them on edge. Then, just as the sun began to dip beyond the trees, they stumbled upon something that stopped them in their tracks. A wooden stake, driven deep into the earth. Tied around it with twine was a scrap of fabric, faded and torn. Nearby, a small pile of stones had been carefully arranged, unnatural in their positioning. Vasquez's stomach tightened. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. "Someone's been here," one of the officers murmured. "Recently." Vasquez crouched, examining the stones. He reached out and gently pushed one aside. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper, brittle and damp from the humidity. Slowly he unfolded it. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were the words: "No mas preguntas. Déjalo ir. No more questions. Let it go." A shiver ran down Vasquez's spine. Whoever had been here knew they were coming, and they wanted the case to die. But Vasquez wasn't about to let that happen. "We keep going," he said, tucking the note into his pocket. "Someone out there doesn't want us to find the truth. And that means we're getting close." Detective Vasquez stared at the message in his hands, the weight of its warning pressing heavily on his chest. "No mas preguntas. Déjalo ir. No more questions. Let it go." But he had no intention of walking away now. Not when they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The jungle around them was thick, its shadows growing deeper as the last traces of sunlight bled through the canopy. His team exchanged nervous glances, some shifting their weight uncomfortably, clearly debating whether to heed the warning. "We're not stopping," Vasquez said firmly. "If someone wants us to leave, it means we're exactly where we need to be." Villarreal swallowed hard. "I hope you know what you're doing, Detective." Ignoring the unease settling over his team, Vasquez motioned for them to press on. They followed the map's markings to the next red X, deeper into the jungle, where few had ventured before. With every step, the tension in the air grew thicker, the feeling of unseen eyes watching them never fading. Then, they found something that made their breath hitch. A small cave, its entrance partially obscured by vines and twisted roots. Something about it felt unnatural, almost staged. Vasquez gestured for his team to stay alert as they approached. Carefully, they stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. But what they found within sent ice through their veins. Against the cave wall, half buried beneath dirt and debris, was an old, tattered backpack. Vasquez's pulse pounded. It was similar to the descriptions of Lisanne Froon's missing backpack, the one that had vanished before being mysteriously recovered miles away in pristine condition. He knelt, brushing away the dirt carefully, revealing a faded strap and remnants of a zipper. His hands trembled slightly as he unzipped it. Inside there were photographs, old, water-damaged, but still visible. Some showed the jungle from eerie angles, reminiscent of the last known images from Kris and Lisanne's camera. Others depicted something far more disturbing. Faces. Unfamiliar faces. Men, some partially obscured, others staring directly into the camera. The expressions were unreadable, neither smiling nor hostile. But their presence in these images, in relation to the missing women, sent a wave of unease through Vasquez. One of the officers sucked in a breath. "Who are they?" Villarreal, pale-faced, took a step back. "I don't know, but I think they know us." The implications settled heavily on them. If these men had been near Kris and Liz and in their final moments, it changed everything. And if these photos had been deliberately hidden, it meant someone had wanted them to stay buried. Then, from the depths of the jungle, a sound broke the silence. A branch snapped. Vasquez whipped around, heart hammering. Flashlights swung in all directions, cutting through the thick undergrowth, but there was no movement. just the oppressive, endless stretch of trees and vines. "Stay together," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. "We're not alone." The jungle had swallowed Kris and Lisanne whole, their story twisted into shadows and half-truths. But Vasquez was determined. They wouldn't let the same thing happen to them. With the photos in hand and the weight of the warning still fresh in their minds, the detective knew this was just the beginning. The truth had waited long enough, and now it was time to bring it into the light.